The dress had been her mother's, ivory silk now yellowed with age, and Lucy Katherine stood alone in the small chapel at Fort Stanton, New Mexico, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows while her hands trembled over the slight swell of her belly, and her groom rode away on his chestnut mare without so much as a backwards glance. She had been foolish to believe Daniel Morrison when he promised her forever, foolish to give herself to him in that moment of passion behind the livery stable 3 months ago, and foolish to think he would actually marry her when the consequences of that night became impossible to hide. The Reverend had cleared his throat awkwardly when Daniel failed to appear at the appointed hour, and Lucy had waited, hoping, praying that he was simply delayed. But then Mary Fletcher, the seamstress's daughter, had burst through the chapel doors with tears streaming down her face and the truth spilling from her lips. Daniel had been seen riding hard toward Texas, his saddlebags packed, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and a woman carrying his child. Lucy felt the eyes of everyone in the small chapel boring into her back. Her father was dead these past 2 years, killed in a mining accident up in the mountains. Her mother had followed him to the grave 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief. Lucy had no siblings, no family to turn to, only the small cottage on the edge of town that her parents had left her, and the position she held as a schoolteacher. A position she would surely lose once the town council discovered her condition. Unmarried women in delicate circumstances were not permitted to teach the children of respectable families. The humiliation burned through her like wildfire. She could hear the whispers starting already, the gasps of shock and disapproval from the handful of guests who had gathered to witness what should have been her wedding. Mrs. Henderson clutched her handkerchief to her chest. Mr. Patterson shook his head slowly. The Reverend looked at her with pity which somehow felt worse than judgment. Lucy gathered what remained of her dignity and turned to face them all. Her chin lifted, though tears blurred her vision. She would not cry, not here. Not in front of these people who had known her since childhood, and would now remember her only as the fallen woman, the foolish girl who gave away her virtue to a man who did not deserve it. She took one step toward the aisle, then another, her legs feeling as though they might buckle beneath her at any moment. The walk from the altar to the chapel doors seemed to stretch on forever, an eternity of shame and regret. Then the doors swung open, and a man stepped inside. Lucy had seen Xavier Zane around Fort Stanton, of course. Everyone knew the ranch hand who worked at the Double Bar Ranch just west of town. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore his working clothes, dusty from a day of riding fence lines, and his hat was clutched in his hands as he stood in the doorway, blocking her escape. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Lucy had never spoken more than a few words to him, though she had noticed him watching her sometimes when she walked through town. She had thought little of it then, assuming he was like most of the other cowboys and ranch hands who sometimes cast appreciative glances her way. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that looked almost like determination. Xavier stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor of the chapel. He walked past the shocked guests, past the Reverend who had opened his mouth to speak but seemed unable to find words, and he came to stand directly in front of Lucy. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low and steady. "Daniel Morrison is a coward and a fool." Lucy could not find her voice. She stared up at him, confused, mortified that he knew about her shame, that everyone would know by nightfall. Xavier glanced at the Reverend, then back at Lucy. When he spoke again, his words were clear enough for everyone in the chapel to hear. I will stand beside you at the altar if you will have me." The chapel erupted in gasps and whispers. Lucy felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What?" she managed to whisper. "Marry me," Xavier said, and there was no mockery in his expression, no cruel jest. "I know you do not love me. I know this is not what you planned. But that child you carry deserves a name, and you deserve better than to face the scorn of this town alone. I am offering you my name, my protection, and a home. I cannot promise you love, but I can promise you respect and honesty. I will be a father to your child, and I will stand by you, if you will let me." Lucy felt tears spilling down her cheeks despite her determination not to cry. She searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some kind of elaborate humiliation, but she found only sincerity in those storm-gray eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other." Something flickered across Xavier's face, an emotion she could not quite name. "Maybe that is reason enough," he said quietly. "Because I can. Because it is the right thing to do. Because every time I have seen you in town, you have been kind to everyone you meet, even when they did not deserve it. Because you deserve someone to be kind to you now." The Reverend cleared his throat. "This is most irregular." Xavier turned to him, his jaw set. "Is there any legal reason why we cannot be married, Reverend?" The Reverend hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "No, I suppose not. If Miss Katherine is willing." Every eye in the chapel turned to Lucy. She could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the curiosity. Her mind raced through her limited options. She could refuse Xavier's offer, return to her cottage, and wait for the scandal to break over her like a wave. She would lose her teaching position. She would become an outcast, and her child would be labeled illegitimate, forever marked by the circumstances of birth. Or she could accept this stranger's extraordinary offer, marry a man she did not know, and give her child a father and a name. It was not truly a choice at all. "Yes," Lucy heard herself say. "Yes, I will marry you." Xavier's expression did not change, but something softened in his eyes. He held out his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation, Lucy placed her trembling fingers in his palm. His hand was warm and calloused from years of ranch work, strong and steady where hers shook. He led her back to the altar, and Lucy felt as though she were moving through a dream. This could not be happening. Just minutes ago, she had been abandoned, humiliated, facing ruin. Now she was standing beside a man she barely knew, about to speak vows that would bind them together for life. The Reverend recovered from his shock and opened his Bible once more. His voice shook slightly as he began the ceremony again, the same words he had prepared for her marriage to Daniel, now spoken for a completely different groom. Lucy could barely focus on the words. She was acutely aware of Xavier standing beside her, solid and real. She could smell leather and sage and something uniquely him. When the Reverend asked if he took Lucy to be his lawfully wedded wife, Xavier answered in a clear, strong voice that echoed through the chapel. "I do." Then it was Lucy's turn, and she had to force the words past the tightness in her throat. "I do." Xavier produced a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band that looked as though it might have belonged to someone else once. He slid it onto her finger with surprising gentleness, and Lucy stared down at it, this symbol of a marriage that should not exist, to a man who was still essentially a stranger. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said, sounding somewhat dazed by the turn of events. "You may kiss the bride." Xavier looked down at Lucy, and she saw him hesitate. Then, with careful deliberation, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture that felt almost protective. It was not the passionate kiss she had once imagined sharing with her husband on their wedding day, but it was kind, and kindness felt precious in that moment. The handful of guests seemed uncertain whether to applaud or flee. Mrs. Henderson looked as though she might faint. Mr. Patterson was shaking his head, though whether in disapproval or amazement, Lucy could not tell. Mary Fletcher was crying into her handkerchief, and Lucy could not blame her. The entire situation was so surreal that tears seemed like the only appropriate response. Xavier turned to face the congregation, keeping Lucy's hand firmly tucked into the crook of his arm. "Thank you all for witnessing our marriage," he said, his tone making it clear that the ceremony was concluded and they were dismissed. People began filing out of the chapel, whispering furiously to one another. Lucy knew that the story of her abandoned wedding and subsequent rescue by Xavier Zane would be the talk of Fort Stanton for weeks, possibly months. But at least it would be a different story than the one that would have circulated otherwise. At least her child would bear the name Zane instead of being born without a father. When the chapel had emptied except for the Reverend, Xavier, and herself, Lucy finally allowed herself to breathe. The Reverend presented them with the marriage certificate, which Xavier signed with a steady hand. Lucy's signature was less certain, her name looking foreign beside his. Lucy Katherine Zane. She was no longer Lucy Katherine. She was someone else now, someone she did not yet know how to be. The Reverend excused himself, muttering something about needing to update the church records, and then Lucy and Xavier were alone in the chapel. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things neither of them knew how to say. "I have a room at the boarding house in town," Xavier said finally. "It is small, but it will do until we can make other arrangements. Unless you would prefer to stay at your cottage." Lucy thought of her small cottage, the one her parents had left her. It held all her memories, all the remnants of her former life, but it also felt impossibly lonely now. "The boarding house," she said quietly. "At least for tonight. Tomorrow we can discuss what comes next." Xavier nodded and offered her his arm again. Lucy took it, and they walked out of the chapel together into the late afternoon sun. She could see curtains twitching in windows along the main street as they passed. Everyone would know by now. The story would have spread through town like wildfire. But Xavier walked beside her with his head held high, as though there was nothing unusual about having married a pregnant woman who had been abandoned by another man just minutes before. They walked in silence through the dusty streets of Fort Stanton. The town was small but prosperous, having grown up around the military fort that gave it its name. The fort itself stood at the edge of town, its adobe walls and buildings housing soldiers who were meant to keep the peace between settlers and the various Apache bands who called these mountains home. Lucy had lived here all her life, had walked these streets 1,000 times, but everything looked different now, strange and unfamiliar. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Callahan, a widow who made her living renting rooms to cowboys, prospectors, and traveling merchants. She answered Xavier's knock on her door, took one look at Lucy's wedding dress, and raised her eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared into her gray hairline. "Well," she said after a long moment, "I heard some interesting news from my neighbor just a few minutes ago, but I did not quite believe it. Congratulations, Mr. Zane. And to you as well, Mrs. Zane." The name sounded wrong to Lucy's ears, but Xavier simply nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan. I will need to speak with you about my room arrangements." "I expect you will," Mrs. Callahan said dryly. "I only rent to single men, Mr. Zane, as you well know. I am not set up to house married couples." Xavier's jaw tightened slightly. "I understand. I will make other arrangements as soon as possible. But for tonight—" Mrs. Callahan sighed and waved them inside. "For tonight, I suppose I can make an exception, but you will need to find somewhere else to live by week's end. I have rules, and I cannot go breaking them for every cowboy who decides to get himself a wife." "Understood," Xavier said. "Thank you for your kindness." Mrs. Callahan led them up the narrow staircase to Xavier's room on the second floor. It was small, as he had warned, with barely enough space for a single bed, a washstand, and a battered chest of drawers. The window overlooked the main street, and through it, Lucy could see the chapel in the distance, its white walls glowing pink in the setting sun. "I will give you some privacy," Mrs. Callahan said, her tone softening slightly as she looked at Lucy's pale face. "There is water in the pitcher if you need to wash. Supper is in an hour if you are hungry." She closed the door behind her, and Lucy found herself alone with her new husband for the first time. The reality of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. She had married a stranger. She was carrying another man's child. Her entire life had been upended in the span of a single afternoon. Her legs gave out, and she sank down onto the edge of Xavier's narrow bed, her hands clutching the fabric of her mother's wedding dress. The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent sobs that shook her shoulders. Xavier stood frozen for a moment, clearly uncertain what to do. Then he crossed the small room and knelt in front of her, his large hands hovering near hers but not quite touching. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I know this is not what you wanted, but I promise you, Lucy, I will do everything in my power to make this right. You will not face this alone." Lucy looked at him through her tears. "Why did you do it?" she asked again. "Please, I need to understand. Why would you tie yourself to me, to a woman pregnant with another man's child? You could have any woman in this territory. Why would you choose this?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers. "I have watched you for a long time," he said finally. "Nearly a year now since I first came to Fort Stanton. I have seen you teaching the children, seen how patient you are with them, even the difficult ones. I have seen you helping Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries when her arthritis flares up. I have seen you visit the sick, bring food to families who are struggling. You are kind, Lucy, genuinely kind, and that is rarer than gold in this world." He paused, seeming to gather his words. "I know you do not love me. I know you loved Daniel Morrison, and he betrayed that love in the cruelest way possible. But I have admired you from afar for months now, never thinking I had any chance of speaking to you, let alone more. When I heard what he did today, I was so angry I could barely see straight. And then I thought, maybe this is my chance. Not to take advantage of your misfortune, but to offer you a way forward, to give myself a chance to prove that I could be worthy of you." Lucy stared at him, shocked by the raw honesty in his voice. "You do not even know me." "Then we will learn," Xavier said simply. "We will learn each other, and maybe in time you will come to care for me even a fraction of what I already feel for you, and if not, I will still keep my promises. I will still be a father to your child and a husband to you in name. But I am hoping, Lucy, that maybe we can build something real from this strange beginning." No man had ever spoken to her with such directness, such vulnerability. Daniel had whispered pretty words and empty promises, but Xavier offered her something different, something honest and solid and real. "I do not know how to do this," Lucy whispered. "I do not know how to be married to someone I barely know." "Neither do I," Xavier admitted. "But we will figure it out together." He stood and moved to the chest of drawers, pulling out a clean shirt. "I will go downstairs and give you some privacy to change. That dress must be uncomfortable. I will see if Mrs. Callahan has something you can borrow for tonight, and tomorrow we will retrieve your things from your cottage." Lucy nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. She did desperately want to get out of this dress, this symbol of all her foolish dreams and broken hopes. Xavier paused at the door. "Lucy, you are not alone anymore. Please remember that." Then he was gone, and Lucy was left sitting on the narrow bed in a stranger's room, married to a man she had barely spoken to, carrying a child that belonged to someone else. But despite the impossibility of it all, despite the fear and uncertainty churning in her stomach, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Relief. Xavier had saved her from ruin, yes, but more than that, he had offered her dignity when she had lost it. He had stood beside her when everyone else had turned away. She stood and began the difficult process of unbuttoning the wedding dress by herself, her fingers clumsy on the small pearl buttons her mother had sewn on so carefully all those years ago. When the dress finally pooled at her feet, Lucy stepped out of it and folded it carefully, her hands lingering on the soft silk. She had worn her mother's dress, but she had not married the man she loved. Somehow that felt like a betrayal, though she knew her mother would have understood. Her mother would have wanted her grandchild to have a name and a future. There was a soft knock at the door, and Mrs. Callahan's voice called out, "Mrs. Zane, I have a nightgown and a dress for you." Lucy wrapped herself in the thin blanket from the bed and opened the door just enough to accept the bundle of clothes Mrs. Callahan passed to her. "Thank you," she said softly. Mrs. Callahan's expression was unreadable. "Your husband is downstairs having coffee. He seems like a good man, for what it is worth." Lucy nodded and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment before pulling on the borrowed nightgown. It was worn but clean, and it felt like a relief to be out of the elaborate wedding dress and in something simple and comfortable. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing her fingers through her long brown hair, when Xavier knocked softly and asked if he could come in. Lucy pulled the blanket around her shoulders and told him to enter. He had brought her a plate of food from the supper Mrs. Callahan had laid out downstairs: bread and butter, cold chicken, and some kind of vegetable stew. Lucy realized she had not eaten since breakfast, too nervous about the wedding to think about food. Now her stomach growled audibly. "Thank you," she said, accepting the plate and eating with more appetite than elegance. Xavier watched her with something like satisfaction, as though her hunger pleased him. "We need to discuss practical matters," he said after she had eaten her fill. "I know it is not romantic, but we should be clear about our situation." Lucy set the plate aside and nodded. "I agree." "I work at the Double Bar Ranch," Xavier began. "I have been there for about 8 months now. The pay is decent, and I have been saving most of my wages. I have enough put aside to rent us a house here in town, something better than this room. There are a few available, I believe. Once we are settled, we can discuss what happens next." "I teach at the school," Lucy said. "Or I did. I assume they will dismiss me now, even though I am married. The pregnancy will show soon, and the timing will make it clear that the child is not yours." Xavier frowned. "That is their business to judge. Let them try. We will tell anyone who asks that the child is mine, conceived before we married. It is no one's concern but ours." "People will count the months," Lucy said bitterly. "They always do." "So the child came early," Xavier said with a shrug. "It happens. Lucy, I know there will be gossip, I know people will talk, but I will not have you feeling ashamed of carrying this baby. That child did nothing wrong, and neither did you. Daniel Morrison is the one who should be ashamed, and I hope he spends the rest of his life regretting what he threw away." Lucy felt fresh tears prickling at her eyes, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had cried earlier. "You are kinder than I deserve. You deserve far better than what you have been given," Xavier said firmly. "But I will do my best to give you a good life, Lucy. I swear that to you." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day settling over them both. Finally, Xavier stood and grabbed his bedroll from the corner of the room. "You take the bed," he said. "I will sleep on the floor." "Xavier, this is your room. I cannot take your bed. You are pregnant and exhausted, and you have been through more today than anyone should have to endure. You are taking the bed, and I will hear no argument about it." His tone was gentle but firm, and Lucy found she did not have the energy to argue. She slipped beneath the thin blankets, still wrapped in the borrowed nightgown, and watched as Xavier made himself a pallet on the floor with his bedroll and a spare blanket. He extinguished the lamp, and the room fell into darkness broken only by the moonlight streaming through the window. Lucy lay staring at the ceiling, listening to Xavier's breathing steady and slow as he settled into sleep. She could not believe that this morning she had woken up thinking she would marry Daniel Morrison, and now she was lying in a different man's bed, wearing a gold ring that bound her to a stranger. But not quite a stranger, she realized. Xavier had revealed more of himself in a few hours than Daniel had in months of courtship. Daniel had told her what she wanted to hear, empty promises and flowery words. Xavier had offered her truth and honesty and a foundation they could build on. She placed her hand over the small swell of her belly, feeling the life growing there. "You will have a father," she whispered into the darkness. "Maybe not the one I planned for you, but a good man, a man who will stand beside us." And for the first time since Daniel had ridden away, leaving her alone at the altar, Lucy felt something that might have been hope. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the New Mexico sun streaming through the window and painting the room in shades of gold. Lucy woke to find Xavier already up, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. He had dressed in clean clothes, and his dark hair was damp as though he had washed at the basin. "Good morning," he said when he saw her stir. "I brought you some coffee and breakfast, Mrs. Callahan insisted. Lucy sat up, acutely aware that her hair was a tangled mess and she was wearing a borrowed nightgown. Xavier seemed determined to look anywhere but directly at her, and she appreciated his attempt at propriety. "Thank you," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The breakfast was simple but filling, eggs and toast and some sliced apples that must have come from Mrs. Callahan's root cellar. "I thought we could go to your cottage this morning and collect your things," Xavier said as she ate. "Then we can look at the houses available for rent in town." "I want to get us settled as quickly as possible," Lucy nodded. "That sounds sensible." She hesitated, then added, "I have some money saved as well. From my teaching salary, we should pool our resources." "We will discuss finances later," Xavier said. "For now, let us focus on finding a home. A real home, not a boarding house room." They walked through Fort Stanton together after Lucy had dressed in the borrowed dress Mrs. Callahan had provided. It was plain brown calico, nothing like the fine dresses Lucy owned, but it was comfortable and it fit well enough. People stared as they passed, and Lucy could hear whispers following in their wake. She kept her eyes forward, her hand tucked into the crook of Xavier's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. Her cottage stood at the edge of town, a small adobe structure with a front porch and a garden that Lucy had been neglecting in recent weeks, too preoccupied with wedding preparations and morning sickness to tend it properly. The door was unlocked, as she had left it when she departed for the chapel yesterday. Walking into the cottage felt strange, as though she were visiting someone else's life. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The dishes from her breakfast yesterday still sat in the basin. The dress she had considered wearing before deciding on her mother's wedding gown was draped over the chair in her bedroom. Evidence of the life she had expected to live, now irrevocably changed. Xavier stood in the main room, taking in the space with a thoughtful expression. "This is a good house," he said. "Solid. Your father built it?" "Yes," Lucy said. "He was a carpenter before he turned to mining. He built this cottage for my mother when they first married." "We could live here," Xavier said slowly, "if you would like. It is already yours, and it would save us the cost of renting another place." Lucy considered that. The cottage held so many memories, both happy and painful, but it was hers, and it was large enough for a small family. There were 2 bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace and a lean-to kitchen out back. It was more space than most cowboys could afford to rent. "Yes," she decided. "I would like that. I think my parents would have liked that too." Xavier smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. "Then this is our home," he said simply. They spent the morning packing Xavier's few belongings from the boarding house and bringing them to the cottage. He did not own much, just his clothes, his saddle and tack, a rifle, and a few personal items that he packed carefully into a worn leather saddlebag. By noon, they had moved everything, and Xavier stood in the bedroom that had belonged to Lucy's parents, looking around at the space that would now be his. "Where will you sleep?" he asked, and Lucy realized they had not discussed this particular detail. "I have been sleeping in my old room," she said. "The smaller bedroom. You can have this one." Xavier shook his head. "That will not work once the baby comes. You will need the larger room for the cradle and all the things a baby requires. I will take the smaller room." "But you are so much taller than I am. You will barely fit in that bed." "I will manage," Xavier said firmly. "This is not up for debate, Lucy. You and the baby need the space more than I do." Lucy wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes. This was important to him, providing for her and the child, even in small ways. So she simply nodded and helped him carry his things to the smaller bedroom. The rest of the day was spent in the strange domesticity of setting up a household together. Xavier repaired a loose shutter that Lucy had been meaning to fix for weeks. She washed the dishes and cleaned the cottage, which had gotten dusty in her distraction. They moved around each other carefully, still learning each other's rhythms, still adjusting to this new reality. In the evening, Lucy cooked supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate together at the small table in the main room, and Xavier complimented her cooking with such sincerity that Lucy found herself blushing. "I am not much of a cook," she admitted. "My mother tried to teach me, but I was always more interested in books than kitchen work." "You are a teacher," Xavier said. "That is more valuable than knowing how to make fancy meals. Besides, this is good food, simple and filling." After supper, Xavier excused himself to go to the saloon. Lucy felt a spike of fear, wondering if he was already regretting their hasty marriage, already seeking escape in whiskey and cards. But he must have seen something in her face because he paused at the door. "I am not going to drink," he said quietly. "I need to speak with my foreman at the Double Bar Ranch. Let him know about the change in my circumstances. The saloon is where the ranch hands gather in the evening. I will be back before dark." "You do not need to explain yourself to me," Lucy said, trying to sound indifferent even as relief flooded through her. "Yes, I do," Xavier said. "We are married, Lucy. That means we talk to each other, we explain where we are going and what we are doing. That is what trust looks like, and I want us to build trust between us." He left, and Lucy sat alone in the cottage, marveling at this man she had married. Daniel had never asked her permission for anything, never explained his comings and goings. He had simply done as he pleased and expected her to wait patiently for his attention. Xavier was different in every way. True to his word, Xavier returned before the sun had fully set, and he brought news. "I spoke with my foreman. I explained that I am married now and will need more reliable hours so I can be home in the evenings. He was understanding, though he gave me no end of grief about getting married so suddenly." "What did you tell him?" Lucy asked. "About us. The truth," Xavier said. That I married you because I wanted to, because I admire you and I want to build a life with you. I did not mention Daniel or the circumstances. That is private between us. Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine. Xavier left early each morning to ride out to the Double Bar Ranch, returning in the late afternoon dusty and tired, but always with a smile for Lucy. She continued to teach at the school, though she knew her time there was limited. Her pregnancy was beginning to show more clearly, and soon the questions would start. They talked more each evening, sharing stories of their pasts. Lucy learned that Xavier had grown up in Texas, the youngest son of a rancher who had lost everything in the years after the war. Xavier had been only 10 years old when his family was forced to sell their land, and he had spent the years since then working various ranch jobs throughout Texas and New Mexico, slowly saving money with the vague dream of someday buying his own land. "That is still my dream," he told her one night as they sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I want a ranch of my own. Not a big spread, just enough land to run some cattle, grow some crops, a place that belongs to us that no one can take away." "That is a good dream," Lucy said softly. "My father had dreams like that too. He wanted to build more houses, create a whole neighborhood here in Fort Stanton. But then he heard about the silver strike up in the mountains, and he thought he could make enough money mining to make all his dreams come true faster. Instead, it killed him." Xavier reached over and took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. It was the most intimate gesture he had allowed himself, and Lucy found comfort in it. She had been surprised to discover that she was growing fond of her accidental husband. He was patient and kind, thoughtful in ways that Daniel had never been. He remembered that she liked honey in her tea. He noticed when she was tired and insisted she rest. He had even started reading to her in the evenings from the books in her small collection, his deep voice bringing the words to life. But he had not kissed her since their wedding day, had not touched her beyond occasional, respectful gestures like holding her hand or steadying her elbow. Lucy found herself thinking about that more than she should. She was pregnant with another man's child, her body already changing in ways that made her feel awkward and ungainly. Yet sometimes she caught Xavier looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch, something heated and longing in his gray eyes before he quickly looked away. She did not love him, not yet, but she could feel something growing between them, something that might become love given time. The trouble came on a Thursday morning in late October. Lucy was teaching her students their arithmetic lessons when the schoolhouse door opened and Mrs. Henderson, the head of the town council's education committee, stepped inside. Lucy felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming, but she had hoped for a few more weeks. "Miss Katherine," Mrs. Henderson said, then corrected herself with visible distaste. "Mrs. Zane. Might I have a word with you outside?" Lucy dismissed her students for an early recess and followed Mrs. Henderson out into the crisp autumn air. The older woman did not waste time with pleasantries. "It has come to the attention of the Education Committee that you are with child," she said bluntly. "The committee has voted, and we have decided that it would be best if you took a leave of absence from your teaching position, effective immediately." "I am married," Lucy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have done nothing wrong." "The circumstances of your marriage are well known to everyone in this town," Mrs. Henderson said coldly. "You were pregnant when you married Mr. Zane, and everyone knows that child cannot be his. We cannot have a woman of questionable morals teaching our children." The injustice of it burned through Lucy like acid. Daniel Morrison had abandoned her, had left her to face ruin alone, yet he faced no consequences. But she, the one who had been betrayed, was being punished for his sins. "This is not fair," she said, hating the way her voice shook. "I am a good teacher, you know I am. The children are learning." "That may be," Mrs. Henderson said, not unkindly but with finality. "But perception matters, Mrs. Zane. We cannot have parents questioning the character of the person educating their children. Perhaps after the baby is born, after some time has passed, we can revisit this discussion. But for now, you are dismissed." Lucy stood in the schoolyard long after Mrs. Henderson had gone back inside to inform the students that they would have a new teacher. She felt numb, hollowed out. Teaching was more than just a job to her. It was her purpose, her passion. And now it had been taken from her because of Daniel's cowardice and the town's judgment. She did not know how long she stood there, but eventually she became aware of someone approaching. She looked up to find Xavier striding toward her, his face set in hard lines. He must have left the ranch and ridden hard to get into town so quickly. Someone must have sent word to him. "I heard," he said simply, and then he pulled her into his arms. Lucy stiffened at first, shocked by the sudden embrace. But then she felt the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and something inside her broke. She clutched at his shirt and cried, great heaving sobs that she had been holding in, all her anger and grief and frustration pouring out of her. Xavier held her through it all, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped securely around her waist. He murmured soft reassurances, told her it would be all right, promised her that they would get through this together. When her tears finally subsided, Lucy pulled back, embarrassed by her loss of control. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I should not have." "Do not apologize," Xavier said firmly. "You have every right to be angry, to be upset. What they did was wrong, Lucy. You are an excellent teacher and those children were lucky to have you." "It does not matter now," Lucy said bitterly. "It is done." "Then we will find another way," Xavier said. "You do not need them, Lucy. You do not need their approval or their job. We will be fine. I make enough at the ranch to support us, and you can focus on preparing for the baby." Lucy knew he was trying to comfort her, but the words felt hollow. She did not want to be supported. She wanted to work, to teach, to have a purpose beyond being someone's wife and someone's mother. But she could not say that without sounding ungrateful, so she simply nodded and let Xavier lead her home. The weeks that followed were difficult. Lucy tried to fill her days with housework and preparing for the baby's arrival, but she felt adrift without the structure of her teaching position. The women of Fort Stanton largely avoided her, crossing the street when they saw her coming, whispering behind their hands. Only a few kind souls like Mary Fletcher and the elderly widow Mrs. Patterson made any effort to include her. Xavier noticed her growing melancholy and tried to lift her spirits in small ways. He brought her flowers from the prairie, bright yellow wildflowers that made her smile despite herself. He carved her a rocking chair for the baby's room, working on it for hours in the evenings until it was smooth and perfect. He read to her from the newspaper, sharing stories of the wider world beyond Fort Stanton. And slowly, gradually, Lucy found herself looking forward to his return each evening. She began to notice small things about him. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentleness of his hands despite their calluses, the patience he showed in all things, never rushing her, never pressuring her for more than she was ready to give. It was a cold evening in November when everything changed between them. Lucy had been feeling the baby move for a few weeks now, little flutters that amazed and terrified her in equal measure. This night, the movements were stronger than usual, and she gasped and placed her hand over her belly. Xavier looked up from the wood he was whittling. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Lucy said, smiling. "The baby is just very active tonight." Xavier set aside his project and came to kneel beside her chair. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering near her belly. Lucy hesitated only a moment before nodding. Xavier placed his large hand gently on the curve of her stomach, and they waited together in silence. Then the baby moved again, a firm push against Xavier's palm, and his face lit up with wonder. "That is amazing," he breathed. "That is a strong baby." "He or she seems determined to make their presence known," Lucy said. Charmed by Xavier's obvious delight, Xavier looked up at her, his hand still resting on her belly. "I know this child is not mine by blood," he said quietly. "But I already love them, Lucy. I want you to know that. I will be the best father I can be to this baby, and to any other children we might have in the future if you will have me." The vulnerability in his voice, the naked hope in his eyes, made Lucy's heart ache. She reached out and cupped his face in her hand, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her palm. "You are a good man, Xavier Zane," she said softly. "Better than I deserve, better than I ever hoped to find." "You deserve the world," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "I wish I could give it to you. You have given me everything that matters," Lucy said, and realized with a start that she meant it. "You have given me your name, your protection, your kindness. You have stood beside me when everyone else turned away. You have made me feel safe and valued when I had lost all hope. How could I ask for more than that?" Xavier's eyes searched hers, looking for something. Whatever he found must have satisfied him because he slowly rose, pulling her gently up with him. They stood facing each other in the firelight, and Lucy felt her breath catch as Xavier reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I want to kiss you," he said, the words barely more than a whisper. "Really kiss you, not just that chaste touch at our wedding, but only if you want me to. Only if you are ready." Lucy knew she should say no. She should tell him she needed more time, that her heart was still healing from Daniel's betrayal. But looking into Xavier's gray eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand against her cheek, she realized that her heart had been healing. Xavier had been mending it piece by piece with his kindness and his patience, and she wanted this. She wanted him. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." Xavier leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, but Lucy did not move away. When his lips finally met hers, it was nothing like the few kisses she had shared with Daniel. This was not rushed or demanding. It was gentle and reverent, as though Xavier was trying to tell her with his kiss all the things he struggled to say with words. Lucy felt something ignite inside her, a warmth that spread through her entire body. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and Xavier deepened the kiss, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. They fit together perfectly despite the swell of her belly between them, and when they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lucy felt dazed. "I am falling in love with you," Xavier said, his forehead resting against hers. "I know I should not say it, that it is too soon and you do not feel the same, but I need you to know. Every day I spend with you, I fall a little harder. You are the first thing I think of when I wake and the last thing on my mind when I sleep. You are everything I did not know I was looking for." Lucy felt tears stinging her eyes, but these were happy tears. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I did not think I could, not after Daniel. I thought my heart was too broken. But you have been putting it back together, Xavier. You have been showing me what real love looks like, what it means to have a partner who truly cares." Xavier kissed her again, and this time there was more heat in it, more need. His hands roamed her back, careful but possessive, and Lucy responded with an eagerness that surprised her. She had not felt desire since before Daniel left, had not thought she would feel it again for a long time. But Xavier made her feel wanted and beautiful, even with her changing body and her complicated circumstances. They did not rush. Xavier was too considerate for that, and Lucy was still navigating her feelings. But that night marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer two strangers bound together by circumstance. They were becoming something real, something that neither of them had quite expected but both were beginning to cherish. The winter months passed in a blur of domesticity and growing affection. Lucy's belly swelled with the advancing pregnancy, and Xavier became increasingly protective, fussing over her constantly and refusing to let her do any heavy work. He had saved enough money to hire a midwife for the birth, a capable woman named Mrs. Garcia, who lived on the outskirts of town and had delivered half the babies in Fort Stanton. Christmas came, and Xavier surprised Lucy with a gift, a beautiful shawl he had purchased from a traveling merchant. Lucy gave him a shirt she had sewn herself, painstakingly stitching it in the evenings after he had gone to bed. They celebrated quietly in their cottage, just the two of them, and it felt perfect in its simplicity. In February, when the New Mexico winds were cold and sharp, Lucy woke in the middle of the night to a sharp pain low in her belly. She lay still for a moment, wondering if she had imagined it, but then another pain came, stronger this time, and she knew. The baby was coming. "Xavier," she called out, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "Xavier, I need you." He was at her side in seconds, still rumpled from sleep. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" "The baby," Lucy said, gripping his hand as another contraction rolled through her. "It is time." Xavier's eyes went wide, and for a moment he looked panicked. Then he seemed to gather himself. All right, I will get Mrs. Garcia. Will you be all right alone for a few minutes?" "Yes," Lucy said, though she was not entirely sure. "Just hurry." Xavier threw on his clothes and boots and ran out into the night. Lucy could hear his horse thundering away toward Mrs. Garcia's place. She tried to focus on breathing through the contractions, which were coming more frequently now. She had heard stories of childbirth from other women, knew it would be painful and difficult, but knowing and experiencing were two very different things. Mrs. Garcia arrived within the hour, a calm and commanding presence in the small bedroom. She shooed Xavier out, telling him to boil water and stay out of the way, and then she focused her full attention on Lucy. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Lucy had never experienced pain like this, waves of it that seemed to consume her entire being. She screamed and cried and begged for it to stop, but Mrs. Garcia remained steady, coaching her through each contraction, telling her when to push and when to rest. Through it all, Lucy could hear Xavier pacing in the main room. Once, between contractions, she heard him praying, his voice rough with emotion. She wanted to call out to him to tell him she would be all right, but she did not have the breath. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, Lucy pushed one last time and felt the baby slip free. There was a moment of terrifying silence, and then a thin, angry cry filled the room. "It is a boy, Mrs. Garcia announced, wrapping the baby in a clean cloth and placing him carefully in Lucy's arms. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Lucy looked down at the tiny face, red and scrunched with displeasure at being thrust into the world, and felt love slam into her with the force of a physical blow. This was her son, her child. Nothing else mattered in that moment, not Daniel's betrayal, not the circumstances of his conception, nothing but this perfect little person she held in her arms. The bedroom door opened, and Xavier stepped in hesitantly. His face was pale, and he looked more frightened than Lucy had ever seen him. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I heard you screaming, and I thought—" "I am fine," Lucy said, her voice hoarse from hours of crying out. "We are both fine. Come meet your son." Xavier approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the bundle in Lucy's arms. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Lucy shifted the baby so he could see better. The infant had stopped crying and was now blinking up at them with unfocused eyes. "He is so small," Xavier whispered, reaching out one finger to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately curled around Xavier's, gripping with surprising strength, and Xavier made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Hello, little one. I am your papa." Lucy felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Xavier with the baby. This man who had no obligation to love this child, who had every reason to resent the circumstances that had brought them together, looked at her son with such pure adoration that it took her breath away. "What should we name him?" Xavier asked, his voice thick with emotion. Lucy had thought about this often over the past months. She had considered family names, biblical names, names that held meaning or significance. But looking at her son now, held safe in the arms of the man who had saved them both, only one name felt right. "Gabriel," she said softly. "It means God is my strength, because God brought us strength when we needed it most." Xavier looked at her, understanding shining in his gray eyes. "Gabriel Zane," he said, testing the name. "It is perfect." Mrs. Garcia finished her work, checking to make sure Lucy was recovering well and that the baby was nursing properly. She gave them instructions for the coming days and promised to check back in a few days. Then she left them alone, this new family of 3, in the small bedroom as the sun set outside. Lucy was exhausted, every muscle in her body aching, but she had never felt more complete. Xavier stayed by her side, helping her adjust the baby when he fussed, bringing her water and food, changing Gabriel's soiled cloths without complaint. He was a natural father, tender and careful, and Lucy fell more in love with him with every passing hour. That night, after Gabriel had nursed and fallen into a milk-drunk sleep, Xavier carried him to the cradle he had built and tucked him in carefully. Then he returned to sit beside Lucy's bed. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me be part of this, for letting me be his father." "Thank you," Lucy countered, "for wanting to be, for choosing us when you could have chosen an easier life." "This is not easier," Xavier admitted with a tired smile, "but it is better. It is everything I did not know I wanted: a wife, a son, a home, a reason to work hard and dream big." "You have given me all of that, Lucy." "We have given it to each other," Lucy said, reaching for his hand. "We are a family now, Xavier, really and truly." He leaned down and kissed her gently, mindful of her exhaustion. "Yes," he agreed, "we are." The weeks after Gabriel's birth were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Lucy was grateful for Xavier's steady presence. He took on extra work around the cottage, cooking meals and washing clothes and rocking Gabriel when Lucy was too exhausted to do more. He never complained, never seemed to resent the upheaval to his life. The people of Fort Stanton slowly began to warm to them again. It was hard to maintain judgment in the face of Xavier's obvious devotion to his family and Lucy's quiet dignity. Women who had shunned her after her wedding began to stop by with baby clothes and advice. Men who worked with Xavier at the Double Bar Ranch congratulated him on his fine son. Gabriel was a good baby, healthy and growing rapidly. He had Lucy's brown hair and a temperament that was sunny and easy. Xavier doted on him, rushing home from the ranch each evening to spend time with his son before bed. He would hold Gabriel for hours, talking to him about horses and cattle, and all the things they would do together when the boy was older. Spring came to Fort Stanton, bringing warm breezes and blooming wildflowers. Lucy felt stronger, her body recovering from the birth. She and Xavier fell into a new rhythm, one that included Gabriel at the center. They were becoming a true family, bound not just by law or circumstance but by genuine love and commitment. One evening in late April, after Gabriel had been put to bed, Xavier asked Lucy to sit with him on the porch. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his hat in his hands. "I have been thinking," he began, "about the future, about what we want for ourselves and for Gabriel." "All right," Lucy said, curious about his serious tone. "I still have that dream of owning land," Xavier said, "of having a ranch of our own. I have been saving money, and I have enough now to make an offer on a piece of property that borders the Double Bar Ranch. It is not big, maybe 160 acres, but it has good grazing land and a water source. We could build a house there, bigger than this cottage. We could run cattle, build something for Gabriel to inherit someday." Lucy's heart began to race. "Are you saying you want to buy land, start a ranch?" "I am saying I want to build a future with you," Xavier said, turning to face her fully. "A real future, not just getting by day to day. I want to give you and Gabriel everything you deserve. But I need to know if that is what you want too, if you are willing to take that risk with me." Lucy thought about her teaching position, lost because of circumstance and judgment. She thought about the cottage that held her parents' memories but also felt small and limiting. She thought about the life Xavier was offering, one of hard work and uncertainty but also possibility and freedom. "Yes," she said, surprised by how certain she felt. "Yes, I want that. I want to build something with you, Xavier. I want to create a home and a legacy for our son, for any other children we might have." Xavier's face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled her into his arms. "We are going to do this," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to make something amazing together." They spent the next months planning and preparing. Xavier put in an offer on the land, and after some negotiation, the deal was made. They owned 160 acres of New Mexico grassland, with a small creek running through it and mountains rising in the distance. It was beautiful and wild and full of promise. Xavier worked extra hours at the Double Bar Ranch, saving every penny he could. Lucy took in sewing and mending, contributing what she could to their growing fund. They pored over plans for the house they would build, discussing how many rooms they needed, where to put the barn and corrals. Gabriel grew and thrived, reaching for everything, babbling happily, and making them both laugh with his antics. Lucy could not remember the man who had left her at the altar without pain, but the pain was distant now, a scar rather than an open wound. Xavier had healed her in ways she had not known she needed, and she loved him with a depth that sometimes took her breath away. In June, they broke ground on their new house. Friends from the ranch came to help, and even some of the townspeople who had shunned Lucy after her abandoned wedding showed up to lend a hand. Over the course of the summer, the house took shape. A sturdy adobe structure with 4 bedrooms, a large main room with a fireplace, and a proper kitchen. It was not fancy, but it was solid and built to last. They moved in during the fall, just before Gabriel's first birthday. Lucy stood in the main room of their new home, holding her son on her hip, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. A year ago, she had been abandoned and alone, facing ruin. Now she had a husband she loved, a healthy child, and a home they had built together. Xavier came up behind her, wrapping his arms around both her and Gabriel. "What do you think?" he asked. "Does it feel like home?" "Yes," Lucy said, leaning back against him. "It feels like exactly where we are meant to be." They settled into life on the ranch. Xavier purchased a small herd of cattle with the last of their savings, and he worked tirelessly to care for them while also building up their property. Lucy managed the household and cared for Gabriel while also learning the ranching business. She discovered she had a talent for keeping the books and managing their finances, making sure every dollar was accounted for and well spent. The work was hard, harder than anything Lucy had done before. But it was satisfying in a way teaching had never been. She was building something tangible, something she could see and touch and pass down to her children. Gabriel celebrated his first birthday with a small party attended by friends and neighbors. He smashed his face into a cake Lucy had baked, getting more on himself than in his mouth, and everyone laughed at his delighted expressions. Xavier held him afterwards, sticky and happy, and Lucy captured the image in her mind, wanting to remember this moment of perfect contentment forever. That night, after Gabriel had been bathed and put to bed, Lucy and Xavier finally had a moment alone together. They sat on the porch of their new house, watching the sun set over their land, and Xavier took her hand. "I have something to tell you," he said, and Lucy turned to look at him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, feeling a flutter of anxiety. "I love you," Xavier said simply. "I know I have said it before, but I need you to understand how much. You have made my life mean something, Lucy. Before you, I was just drifting, working one job after another, saving money for a dream that felt impossible. But you gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to work hard to build something lasting. You gave me a family. And I want you to know that I have never regretted standing beside you at that altar, not for one single moment. Marrying you was the best decision I have ever made." Lucy felt tears welling up, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible. You saved me, Xavier, but you did more than that. You helped me save myself. You showed me that I was strong enough to build a new life, that I deserved happiness and love, and you have given me both in abundance." Xavier pulled her close and kissed her deeply, with all the passion and love that had grown between them over the past year and a half. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier smiled at her. "I think it is time we added to our family," he said softly. "If you are willing. I want Gabriel to have siblings. I want our house to be filled with children and laughter and love." Lucy had been thinking the same thing for weeks now. Gabriel was thriving, and she felt strong and healthy again. The idea of having another child, one that Xavier would be father to from the very beginning, filled her with joy. "Yes," she said, smiling. "I want that too." That night, they came together as husband and wife in the fullest sense, their love physical and emotional and complete. Lucy had been nervous, memories of her single encounter with Daniel still causing her some anxiety. But Xavier was patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and cherished every step of the way. It was nothing like her experience with Daniel. This was love, real and deep and mutual, and Lucy felt as though she was finally, truly whole. The months that followed were golden. Their small herd of cattle flourished, and Xavier was able to purchase more. They hired a ranch hand, a young man named Tom who had just arrived in Fort Stanton looking for work. Lucy discovered she was pregnant again in the early spring, and Xavier was overjoyed, kissing her belly and talking to the baby that grew there just as he had with Gabriel. Though this time from the very beginning, Gabriel was walking now, toddling around the ranch and getting into everything. He adored his father, following Xavier everywhere he could, and Xavier patiently included him in ranch work, letting the toddler help with tasks that would have been easier done alone. Lucy sometimes thought about Daniel Morrison, wondered where he had gone and what had become of him. But the thoughts were fleeting and held no pain. He had been a chapter in her life that was closed, and she had no desire to reopen it. Her life was here, with Xavier and Gabriel and the new baby on the way. This was her real story, the one that mattered. In November, Lucy gave birth to their second son. The labor was shorter this time, and Mrs. Garcia declared it one of the easiest births she had attended. They named him Samuel, after Xavier's father, and Gabriel was fascinated by his new baby brother, wanting to hold him constantly, and patting his tiny head with careful toddler hands. Xavier was even more smitten than he had been with Gabriel, if that was possible. He would hold Samuel for hours, marveling at his tiny features, his small fingers and toes. "Our son," he would say to Lucy, his voice full of wonder, "our baby that we made together." The first years of Samuel's life flew by in a blur of activity. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Xavier's hard work and Lucy's careful management meant they were slowly building wealth. Not riches by any means, but a comfortable life with security and opportunity. They added more cattle, built a larger barn, and improved their house with small luxuries like glass windows and a proper stove for the kitchen. Gabriel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. He followed his father everywhere, learning to ride almost before he could walk properly, and he was gentle with his younger brother, protective and kind. Samuel was different from Gabriel, quieter and more thoughtful, but no less loved. In the spring of Gabriel's 5th year and Samuel's 2nd, Lucy discovered she was pregnant again. This time, Xavier hoped aloud for a daughter, someone to dote on and spoil. Lucy laughed at his transparency but privately hoped the same thing. She loved her sons fiercely, but the idea of a daughter appealed to her. Their prayers were answered in December when Lucy gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew along the creek on their property, and Xavier was absolutely besotted with her from the moment he held her. Gabriel and Samuel were equally enchanted with their baby sister, though Samuel was a bit jealous of the attention she received. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next years. The ranch thrived, becoming one of the more prosperous in the area. Xavier hired more ranch hands as their herd grew, and Lucy found herself managing not just their household, but also cooking for the workers and keeping the ranch accounts. She was busier than she had ever been as a teacher, but she loved it, loved being part of building something significant. Gabriel grew into a responsible young man, taking on more duties at the ranch and showing a natural aptitude for ranching. Samuel was quieter, more interested in books and learning, and Lucy taught him herself in the evenings, passing on her love of education. Rose was spirited and fearless, a tomboy who insisted on following her brothers and father everywhere, much to Xavier's amused consternation. One evening when Gabriel was 10, Samuel was 7, and Rose was 5, the family gathered around the dinner table for their evening meal. It had become their tradition to share stories from their day, and tonight Xavier had a particular story to tell. "I saw someone in town today," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "Someone from our past." Lucy looked up from cutting Rose's meat, her heart skipping a beat. "Who?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. "Daniel Morrison," Xavier said, his eyes on her face, watching for her reaction. "He came back to Fort Stanton. He looks rough, like life has not been kind to him." Lucy felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity and old pain and, surprisingly, pity. "Did you speak with him?" "Briefly," Xavier said. "He asked about you, actually. Asked if I knew what had become of you." Gabriel, who was old enough to know the basic story of his parentage, looked between his parents with concern. Lucy had told him the truth when he was 8, wanting him to hear it from her rather than discover it through town gossip. Gabriel had processed the information thoughtfully, and then declared that Xavier would always be his real father, the one who mattered. Lucy had cried at his words, and Xavier had hugged Gabriel tight, promising he felt exactly the same. "What did you tell him?" Lucy asked Xavier now. "I told him you were my wife, that you had been for over 10 years now, that we had a ranch and a family and a good life." I did not mention Gabriel specifically, but he seemed to understand. Xavier paused, then added, "He said he was sorry, for what it is worth." Lucy sat quietly for a moment, absorbing this information. Then she looked around the table at her family. Gabriel, strong and kind. Samuel, thoughtful and gentle. Rose, fierce and loving. And Xavier, her partner in all things, the man who had stood beside her when she had nothing and built a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. "It is worth very little," she said finally. "Whatever regrets Daniel Morrison carries are his to bear. I have no room in my life for them. This is my family, this is my life, and I would not change a single moment of it." Xavier smiled at her, that slow, warm smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. "Neither would I," he said. They did not speak of Daniel Morrison again. He left Fort Stanton a few days later, and Lucy never saw him. She felt no need to. That chapter of her life had closed long ago, and the story she was writing now was so much better than anything she had imagined in her youth. The years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythm of ranch life and the milestones of their growing children. Gabriel grew into a fine young man, eventually falling in love with a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread and marrying her when he turned 21. Xavier helped them build a house on the far corner of their property, and Gabriel started his own small herd, building his legacy just as his father had. Samuel surprised everyone by expressing a desire to become a doctor. Lucy encouraged his ambition, and they saved money to send him to medical school back east. It was hard to let him go, but they were proud of his determination and intelligence. He promised to return to Fort Stanton when his training was complete and set up a practice there. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman who could ride and rope as well as any cowboy. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet strength, and Lucy knew she would be a force to be reckoned with. Rose showed no interest in settling down young, declaring she wanted to help run the ranch and learn everything there was to know about the business first. Lucy and Xavier grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies bearing the marks of hard work and time. But their love only deepened, maturing into something solid and unshakable. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over their land, holding hands and talking about their day. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Lucy with a gift. He led her out to a spot on their property where the wild roses grew thick along the creek bank, and there he had commissioned a simple bench to be built, with a plaque that read, "For Lucy, who stood beside me and built a kingdom from dust. All my love, Xavier." Lucy cried when she saw it, touched beyond words by the gesture. They sat on the bench together, listening to the creek burble past and the wind whisper through the grass, and Xavier took her hand. "I told you once that marrying you was the best decision I ever made," he said. "That is still true every single day. You have been my partner, my lover, my best friend. You have given me a family and a home and a purpose. You have made my life extraordinary, Lucy. I just wanted to make sure you knew that." "I know," Lucy said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Because you show me every day. You have been my salvation, Xavier, and my greatest joy. When I stood in that chapel all those years ago, abandoned and alone, I thought my life was over. I could never have imagined that it was actually just beginning, that the best parts were still ahead of me. You gave me that. You gave me everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of a failed dream. Gabriel's children, Lucy and Xavier's grandchildren, eventually came to visit the ranch, filling it with noise and laughter. Samuel returned from medical school and set up his practice in Fort Stanton, just as he had promised. He never married, content with his work and his family. Rose eventually did fall in love with a cowboy who worked on their ranch, and she married him in a ceremony held right there on their property, under the wide New Mexico sky. Lucy and Xavier watched their family grow and prosper, watched their children and grandchildren thrive, and they knew that they had built something that would last long after they were gone. The ranch that had started as a dream, purchased with hard-earned savings and built with sweat and determination, had become a legacy. On a warm summer evening when Lucy was 62 and Xavier 65, they sat together on their bench by the creek. Xavier had slowed down in recent years, his body bearing the toll of decades of hard ranch work. Lucy had insisted he do less, let their ranch hands and their children handle more, but Xavier was stubborn. The ranch was his life's work, and he could not quite step away from it entirely. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lucy asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "The day you walked into that chapel and changed everything." Xavier smiled, his gray eyes still sharp despite his age focusing on her face. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about how scared I was, how certain I was that you would refuse me. I had no business making such an offer. I was just a ranch hand with a few dollars saved and a dream. But I looked at you standing there in that wedding dress, trying so hard to be brave, and I knew I had to try. I could not let you face that alone." "I am so glad you did not," Lucy said, squeezing his hand. "I am so glad you were brave enough to stand beside me that day. You saved me, Xavier, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Xavier corrected gently. "You gave my life meaning, Lucy. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting. Everything good in my life started the moment I walked through those chapel doors." They sat together as the sun set, just as they had done countless times over the past decades. The ranch spread out around them, a testament to their hard work and enduring love. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the property, living their own lives but always coming back to this place that Xavier and Lucy had built together. Lucy thought about the girl she had been at 22, standing alone at the altar in her mother's wedding dress, humiliated and terrified. She thought about the long journey from that moment to this one, all the challenges they had faced and overcome together. The ranch that had almost failed in the early years when drought hit, the illnesses and injuries that were part of life on the frontier, the judgment and gossip that had eventually faded into respect and acceptance. Through it all, Xavier had been beside her, steady and true. He had kept every promise he made that day in the chapel. He had been a father to Gabriel, raising him with the same love and care he showed Samuel and Rose. He had been a partner to Lucy, valuing her opinions and respecting her contributions to their success. He had been faithful and kind and devoted, showing her every day what real love looked like. "Thank you," Lucy said softly, looking at Xavier with eyes that had seen him in every light, in good times and hard times, in youth and now in the silver years. "Thank you for standing beside me at that altar. Thank you for choosing me and Gabriel when you had no reason to. Thank you for 24 years of love and partnership and building this beautiful life together." Xavier leaned over and kissed her, his lips still warm and familiar despite the decades. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat," he said. "Every single moment. You are my heart, Lucy Zane. You always have been." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they sat together on their bench by the creek, surrounded by the land they had claimed and the family they had built. The wild roses bloomed around them, filling the air with their sweet scent, and in the distance, they could hear the laughter of their grandchildren playing before bedtime. It was a good life, Lucy thought. Not the one she had planned when she was young and foolish and in love with the wrong man. But a better one, a richer one. A life built on solid ground with a man who had proven his love not with pretty words but with consistent action and unwavering devotion. Years later, when their children and grandchildren told the story of how Lucy and Xavier came to be together, they would speak of it as a love story. Not a conventional one, but a true one. The tale of a woman who was abandoned and a man who was brave enough to stand beside her. The story of a marriage that began with pragmatism and grew into a love that lasted a lifetime. Lucy and Xavier lived into their 80s, spending their final years surrounded by family and watching their great-grandchildren play in the same fields where their own children had grown up. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at 84, Lucy held his hand and whispered her thanks for one last time, for the life he had given her, for the family they had built, for standing beside her when it mattered most. Lucy followed him less than a year later, unable to imagine a life without her partner of nearly 50 years. They were buried side by side on their ranch, under the shade of a cottonwood tree with a view of the mountains and the creek where the wild roses grew. Their children ensured that the ranch remained in the family, passing down not just the land but the story of how it came to be. Gabriel's children worked the ranch alongside Rose's children, and Samuel's legacy lived on in the medical practice he had established in Fort Stanton. The bench that Xavier had commissioned for their 20th anniversary remained by the creek, weathered by time but still solid. Generations of their descendants would sit there, watching the sunset and listening to the story of Lucy and Xavier, of a pregnant woman abandoned at the altar, and a cowboy who said he would stand beside her. A story that began with heartbreak but ended with a love that transcended time and left a legacy that would last for generations to come. It was proof that sometimes the greatest love stories are not the ones that begin with passion and romance, but the ones that are built slowly and steadily, brick by brick, day by day, on a foundation of respect and commitment and the simple act of choosing to stand beside someone when it matters most. Lucy and Xavier had chosen each other, and that choice had created something extraordinary. Their story became a legend in Fort Stanton, told and retold, a reminder that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, and that the person who saves you might be the stranger you least expect. It was a story of redemption and second chances, of building something beautiful from the ashes of disappointment, of finding your true partner in the moment when you thought all hope was lost. And in the end, standing beside someone at the altar was not just about a moment or a ceremony. It was about a lifetime of standing beside them through every challenge and triumph, every joy and sorrow, building a life together one day at a time until the days became years, and the years became a legacy that would outlive them both. That was the story of Lucy Katherine and Xavier Zane, a tale of the Wild West and enduring love, proof that the right person will stand beside you at the altar, and then spend the rest of their life standing beside you through everything that comes after.